Good afternoon, all. I think there's still people coming in as we speak. So I'm Darren Gardner, Business Development Executive for the Data Lab, and welcome to the Data-Driven Innovation for Net Zero event as part of the Energy Technology Partnership webinar series. So we've got 3 speakers this afternoon, and hopefully they'll be giving us a short presentation with some time for a quick Q&A afterwards. I'm kicking off just in a minute or so with a brief presentation just to give an overview of the area, and then we'll lead into the speakers. So my colleague Sarah at ATP will give us a quick indication if there's still people waiting to come in, but we might just start anyway since we're a few minutes over. So I'll just kick off with my slides. Can everybody see those slides? Oh, hold on, I can't see anybody's faces here. So I'll do a quick introduction to the Data Lab. We're one of 7 innovation centres in Scotland funded by the Scottish Government, and our aim is simple. We're just to try and accelerate the journey in the data science and AI space by fueling innovation through collaboration, building skills and growing talent across Scotland's thriving data science community. In terms of how we do that, we've got a number of key areas that we have services in. These are available to all Scottish-based companies, whether they're SMEs or large corporates. And that generally is around supporting innovation with collaborative projects with academics, or a small data science team that can provide technical support, and development of what we call transformational projects, which are generally across a sector or across a supply chain. We have a torch service, which is focused on the selection of data analytical tools and data architecture, and lots of case studies on the work we do. In relation to skills and talent, we are involved in executive education with leadership training, online learning courses, of which there's a new AI one planned for later this year. We fund 155 master's places across Scotland in various data science courses, and then do placements with about 100 of those students into companies over the summer period, which is just finished. We fund a small number of PhDs and do some data education for work in Edinburgh area and skills resources across Scotland. And as building a community through lots of events we do through the year. Data Fest, obviously there's events happening this week, both Tuesday and Wednesday. If people are interested or already signed up. And we've just launched an online community which is aiming to try and effectively scale up the work we do across the Data Lab for Scotland and beyond. So some of the issues here around net zero and data and digitalization, I'll just touch on a few of them, and obviously the speakers will no doubt cover some of them as well. So some of the operational challenges that we need to think about are that in terms of the existence of the data, does the data we want exist? Are the gaps in the data sets fully understood? Do we have the quality of data that we need? Often that is not the case, and there may be a poor knowledge of what we actually need. And is the data at the right frequency? Is it coming in every 6 months, every month, daily, every minute? What's actually required? Discoverability is, do organizations know where to find useful data sets, which I think we deal with a lot of companies who maybe have a rather sketchy idea of where they would find the data that might be of value to them. And then even if they can understand what data they're looking for, is it accessible? Can that data be gathered or accessed internally, if it's your own organization, or externally with other organizations via APIs, which is again an ongoing issue across a lot of sectors. In terms of understandability, that even if you have data, do you know how to use it? Do you know how to visualize insight from it? And perhaps most importantly, the skills that does your organization and the sector have the people trained to use the data and generate insight from it. And then you have to consider the issue of blending existing unconnected, almost kind of very early stage digital technology with new data-driven systems. And I think all of that, albeit the slide's not quite clear, is the role of policy and governance in that and requiring changes there. One of the biggest things I think I'd like to stress here is that it's a very simple term in organizations, but resource efficiency and how data can help drive that. Understanding the resources you have, how you utilize them and how you optimize their use. And that in terms of net zero will work across organizations and sectors. looking at energy use, logistics, procurement, operations. And I think it's often underestimated that one of the big value drivers of data and digitalization is effectively that efficiency gains and optimization that you can get from it. There's an old Peter Drucker, who's a business guru from many years ago, who said that you can't manage what you can't measure, and a lot of that's very true with data. If you don't actually have data, or the data on particular issues, then it's a struggle to actually understand and measure things properly. Also, thinking about data-driven innovation is generally a catalyst to new activity and new ways of doing things. I mean, we've funded in the last 7 years over 140 projects, and in those organizations that opens up and gives them new insight into what the art of the possible is, and it can often act as a catalyst for new activity in the data and data science space. I think importantly that the more activity we see across, obviously not just within a net zero context, but more broadly across the economy, you get a trusted baseline of activity internally at an organizational level, at a sectoral and economic level. And those are critical baselines for governments to understand, what's working, what's not working, and where legislation is actually required. For example, in the energy sector, you'll be talking about, it's a scale and management of massive distributed operations. At the moment, you have, say, 400 players in the sector. You could, in a sense, be going up to 50 million, where you've got those actors, where they're consumers, you've got heat pumps, you've got electric vehicles, and all those assets have to be managed in an integrated and an intelligent way. And then lastly, there's human behavior, that you have to understand how humans will engage with new data systems, and make sure that you're optimizing it in that respect. Some of the data and digital issues and opportunities I think will be touched on today is that, what does data-driven innovation mean? Well, it's not just simply about data or data science. It's actually a whole host of connected areas, technologies, and systems. I think organizations have to think about, it's not just data, it's generally going to be information and communication technologies. 5G would just be an example of a kind of a frontier one in the comm space. But you're talking about harnessing data science and AI techniques around machine learning. You've also got autonomous systems, which are going to rely on a lot of IoT systems, sensors, and edge computing. And generally, you've also, with data, you're talking about data-driven insight, decision-making, and more complex visualizations. And are you deriving the insight you need from the data that you have? Then you have to think of cybersecurity and obviously the resilience of systems that are heavily data-driven, and where you've got consumer data, organizational data, sectoral data, all swimming about potentially in sort of open data systems. And again, this is a constant evolution of data-driven innovation, that this is about that systems become smart, remain smart, but are also flexible enough to integrate new data sources, new technologies, and obviously that would include ICT as well as data science technologies. And all of the above requires people in organizations and across sectors who have the technical skills to build, manage, and operate smarter systems. So it's all very well saying that we'll have a data-driven economy, but underpinning that will have to be people, and people who actually understand, how to use these systems properly. I think a couple of questions it's always worth asking within an organization is, where are the data skills in your organization? And the list here isn't extensive, but is it part of at the core of what you do, or have you some capability, or are you sticking with spreadsheets? I think you have to ask yourself where you are in your journey and what you need to do to change, and those are important questions to ask. And also, what kind of organization are you with regards to data technologies? Are you constantly looking at state of the art and adapting and adopting to new technologies in your business model? Is it something about it's a priority some of the times, but it's always a struggle to do properly? Or there are other priorities altogether? Or in fact, you're not interested in data and digital technologies at all? And I think there are companies and sectors probably in each of those categories. And one of the things to understand is, you can't innovate from every innovation journey, and it is really a journey, is different, but you have to look at and be pragmatic about where you are and where you want to be and how you need to change. So that's just a quick overview of one perspective from the Data Lab on data-driven innovation. And now the event speakers, we've got 3 speakers with us today who represent, I suppose, different aspects of data-driven innovation. The running order slightly changed, but I say we've got Varun Sharma from the Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of Enium, and he'll talk about the sort of the integration of renewables and the role of data and data science in that. We've got Lee Wilson, product owner and data and analytics at ScottishPower, obviously a large corporate in Scotland and very much a player in terms of the utility sector. And Peter Young, Chief Executive of Global Surface Intelligence, who are using Earth observation data to, not only originally looking at forestry as an asset, but obviously moving forward, looking at supporting a better understanding of the environment and climate change generally. So with that, I'll hand over to Lee, who's going to be our first speaker. And I'll stop sharing and let her share her screen. Lee, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Sorry, I am just getting these slides up on screen. Let me know if those look okay, Darren.
Yep, if you just want to sort of make that's you, full size screen.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me along today. I'm delighted to join you to talk about how data-driven innovation can help us achieve a net zero future. I'm quite new in role, so I joined at the beginning of the year. It's a completely new role at ScottishPower, so product owner for data and analytics in a completely new team. So I'm part of the digital hub team, which has been introduced to support all of our colleagues across ScottishPower's 3 businesses. So the retail division, the networks and distribution business, and the renewable electricity generation business to use digital technologies to innovate and transform so that we can help achieve a more sustainable business model for the future. So this topic is very, very dear to my heart. I wanted to just start by thinking about how data can help us frame the question. The climate emergency, the climate challenge is a big, messy, complex problem. And so it's exactly the kind of problem that data techniques and tools can help us to help people to understand, to actually try and structure the problem. So you may have seen these before. These are the climate warming stripes. They were created by Professor Ed Hawkins at the National Centre for Atmospheric Science. And I think this is a very powerful visual. These kind of data visualization techniques can act as a leveler. So you heard Darren talking about where do the data skills sit within your organization. The truth is that solving the climate emergency will take all of us. And so as much as we can do, yes, to bring people across the learning curve on data techniques, data tools, but also to make information as accessible as possible to people that need it in order to take action. And that's all of us. So the picture you can see on screen here is from, it covers Scotland. It covers data from 1844 through to 2020. And you can go on to showyourstripes.org and type in your location. And the other nice thing about this data visualization method is it makes it local. So instead of it being this big amorphous problem that people might struggle to interact with, they can start to see the impact that the climate emergency is having on their local area. And down in the right-hand side, you can see there, that's actually our headquarters on St Vincent Street. We've got these stripes painted on the front of our building as part of our COP26 activities. But to be honest, I would love it if they stay there, because I think it is a real reminder as we're going into work of why it's so mission critical that we do find a more sustainable means of generating, distributing and using electricity. For some reason, I've gone right to the end of my presentation, which is very fast. So the other thing that data can do is it can help us talk with precision. So Darren again mentioned net zero. I think it's really important that we think about targets that people can understand and we're really clear about the goals we're setting ourselves. So there are many people who'd like to see us go beyond net zero and actually move into a negative space and try to reverse the impacts of climate change. But actually the goal of any governments, including our own, is to achieve that balance for the moment and really to stop that vicious reinforcing cycle of climate warming and those worst, most negative impacts. And so net zero as a goal refers to achieving an overall balance between the emissions that are produced and the emissions taken out of the atmosphere. So where does that leave us as individuals and as companies? So at ScottishPower, we've been thinking, how do we keep ourselves honest on what we're committing? How do we make sure we play our part to the fullest? And so we've signed up to the Science-Based Targets commitments. There are around 1,500 organizations across the globe currently signed up to Science-Based Targets. And basically this takes the latest scientific thinking and use the scientific method to try to help organizations understand the impact that they're having upon the climate. So what is your carbon footprint as baseline, and how do you set targets that will allow you to get to the point where you can contribute to the achievement of that net zero target? So these were born of the 2015 Paris Climate Conference, the same one that's coming to Glasgow in just a few weeks. And I think lots of hopes pinning on that one in terms of some real, credible, tangible follow-through actions. What happened in the Paris Agreement was the world came together and effectively set a goal to try to prevent global warming by 1.5 degrees. And the thinking was that would prevent some of the worst material impacts of climate change. So the science-based targets are linked to those commitments, and essentially it's a global framework to allow companies to track their carbon footprint and to continue to improve that as the data points get better. So it's not a perfect data set, but what it does start to do is say, let's use the data you've got and let's work out the data you need to start capturing so that you can track and actually understand if the treatments and changes you're applying are having an impact. So we've set out goals that basically gives you a budget, a bit like a financial budget, for the next 5, 10 and 15 years. Since 2016, we've almost reduced our carbon footprint for ScottishPower by 50%, and we have a goal to reduce it by more than a further 50% by 2030, so less than 10 years' time. And these changes are very significant, as you can imagine, but that is the kind of pace that we need to deliver on and really be alive to across every single industry as well as lifestyles, so that we can achieve this goal for net zero in time to avoid the 1.5 global warming. But it's not just about our own carbon footprint. We also have a really privileged role actually within the energy industry. And it's one of the reasons that I joined ScottishPower and switched into that industry. We have a key role to play in helping all elements of society make this transition. So we need to modernise and decarbonise our energy system. We need to create the basis for digitalisation so that people can innovate, providing new products and services to help more people reduce their carbon footprint. But we need to do that in a way that supports people on that journey. So making sure that we protect customers in vulnerable situations, that we do it in a really inclusive way, and we continue to do that on a value for money basis, particularly given the models of funding and the fact that almost everyone needs electricity in order to live their lives. So we have to make sure there's an affordability test in there, all the while keeping our eyes on the prize that all of that has to be done while focusing on our contribution to the net zero target. So I thought it might help just to explain across our 3 businesses, what are some of the projects that we're doing at the moment to try and make those changes a reality. So we have 3 types of energy, electricity, I beg your pardon, generation business. We have onshore and offshore wind, we've got hydrogen, and we have solar. And so one of the projects that my team's been involved in supporting the renewables business is around turbines. So historically, we would have gone to a turbine if it was broken and not functioning, or we would have gone to it because it was scheduled really an inspection for maintenance. So we've been looking at using machine learning techniques to undertake some predictive maintenance. So essentially that's looking at if we inspect to maintain the asset on a different frequency, or when we spot particular types of patterns coming up in the way that an asset like a wind turbine is behaving, can we actually increase the lifespan or the productivity of that asset so that we can generate more electricity and do it in a more efficient way as well. What's been really challenging around this opportunity is building something that's extensible. So one of the big pieces that I'm learning coming from banking into the energy industry is some assets have been around for decades. There are lots of new players that come into the market, even more so now. And so we need to make sure it can cope with old wind turbines as well as new ones. Iberdrola, which is our parent company, has 16 different markets that currently use wind turbines. And so also we want to make sure it can cope with different languages. And as we add more intelligent assets, which might be in themselves able to make decisions at the edge, I guess, so make their own decisions about when to call for maintenance, when to cease, and sort of protect the quality of the infrastructure associated with it, we're getting more and more data points coming online. And so that means people working in different ways, looking at new types of data, and actually in some cases allowing machine learning to form part of the solution by in itself as well. We've been doing this project jointly with MIT, and it was actually one of the first machine learning models we deployed through my team, and it helps us not only to reduce costs, it helps us to avoid unnecessary journeys for engineers. It also allows us to prolong the lifetime of the asset, therefore saving money and helping to make sure that we avoid wastage in the electricity generation business. The second example I wanted to talk about is the networks business. And if you'd like more details on this, because it is quite a big, complex area, there's a link at the bottom there to our digitalization strategy, and it's currently out for consultation. So we'll be publishing a final version in December. Please do read it and share your thoughts and feedback either with me or directly onto the page. The networks business is essentially the bit that sits between the electricity generation and the electricity consumption. So at the top, historically, you had a small number of power plant generators generating the electricity, and at the bottom, you had effectively a largely passive consumer base who were using that electricity. Fast forward to now, and actually even more so into the future, and it is a very different tomorrow. So we have not only more and more people entering the energy generation side of things, we've also got the emergence of prosumers, so people who are not just actively consuming energy, but want to play their part in generating it. So it might be solar panels on their rooftop, it might be that they've got battery storage, they may even have be thinking about how they can sell on some of the surplus energy that's generated there to their neighbours, and we start to see the emergence of these kind of neighbourhood microgrids where people are plugging together and essentially buying their own turbine, for example. And so what that means is the whole energy system is becoming much more decentralised, and for that to work, which it does need to if we're going to electrify transport and see the reduction of use of petrols, for example, and we're going to have heat pumps instead of consuming gas, all of which will help us get to that net zero goal. What's happening is the number of points at which decisions have to be made around how to route electricity through all the cables and wires, and the patterns of usage are changing massively, and so it's much more volatile, it's much more complex, and the speed of decisioning has to be that much faster. And was there ever a better use case for how you use data to introduce intelligent decision making in a network? And so for me, it's intertwined. Smart grids are absolutely fundamentally critical in order to achieve decarbonisation through digitalising the energy system. And so what's interesting is we'll start to see much more connectedness, partnering across what I've heard many people refer to as the emerging EnTech or energy tech ecosystem. I guess the other key thing just to highlight on this page, it does mean that energy and data needs to be bidirectional. So we need to make sure that we're sharing things so that we can support services, whether consumers choose to be passive or active. And also we see more and more people looking at new models of energy generation and storage. So there are a number of things happening in the battery technology space that mean we might see batteries play a much stronger role in that volatile space to help us store and release energy when the wind is not blowing or the sun is not shining, to use a much coined phrase. I wanted to just do a bit of a shout out for the team at the Energy Systems Catapult. They've done a brilliant job, I think, in trying to map some of the changes that are taking place in that emerging EnTech ecosystem. So actually what we're going to see is many, many more companies interacting around the sharing of data and supporting those different models of engagement. And I thought this was a really nice description of some of the emerging service and product propositions in that space. The link is just on the right-hand side if you would like to check it out in a bit more detail. But I wanted to just mention, we do also have one of our 3 businesses is a retail business. And within retail, obviously, we're looking at how we can introduce new products and services that innovate and help customers make better decisions about how to improve their energy consumption, and also putting the power and the information in their hands. So we're continuing to support government's rollout of the smart metering solutions, and we're also looking at how we can use that data to create better products and services to serve customers. We're also supporting the rollout of electric vehicle charging points, both in terms of public, but also in terms of commercial and public sector charging points. And so you've probably seen some of the electric vehicles, I think some from Spain, some from retail, going around some different cities. I saw they launched the Edinburgh one fairly recently as well. And so I think that's really exciting, because we can start to see it impacting different areas of our lives. And then on the left-hand side, you can see another helpful data visualization, looking at how customers interact with our business. So what are some of the drivers of customer satisfaction and advocacy? What are some of the drivers of customer detraction complaints? And how do we look at opportunities to improve customer journeys? And also, how do we support more customers who find themselves in vulnerable situations to access the right kind of solutions to support their needs? And so we really kind of are thinking about how do we modernise ScottishPower and play our part in modernising the energy system at large to support green recovery. So that means thinking about the ways that we can use data and digitalisation to ensure the supply of renewable low carbon energy in a really efficient and environmentally friendly way. How do we support green infrastructure changes? The shifts that are coming in terms of consumption patterns, usage are phenomenally large. So how do we make sure that we are geared up and we've run simulations and we have all the right resilience baked into the system to support some of that? And supporting our workforce in terms of reskilling. So we've got lots of different programs going on in the company just now, more to be launched this year and next year. And you probably saw Keith Anderson, our chief executive, just announced about 150 new jobs as part of the green recovery model and the support that we're providing at ScottishPower. But not only that, we need to take our stakeholders and our customers with us. That might mean people in our supply chain. It might mean stakeholders who are using, for example, our networks business, but don't choose to operate with our retail business, who still need resilience and assuredity of supply, and may want to introduce new connection points, for example, for electric vehicles, but also through using some of the digital toolings and making sure that we support everyone on that transition. And then last but not least, green research and development. I've talked a little bit today about how the market itself is changing, how we're going to see much more collaboration. My team, for example, the Digital Hub is looking at lots of opportunities to innovate. So we're constantly running proof of concepts, working with the business to understand opportunities to deliver value for stakeholders. And so we're really keen to hear from people with good ideas in the R&D space, because we do try to approach that scientific method and that test and learn approach to understand where we can make the greatest difference on net zero and for our customers. I just wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me along today. We'll see if there's any questions in a moment, but should you wish to reach out with me either with ideas or for more information on any of this, or to share your feedback on the digitalisation strategy, my email address is on the slide in front of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lee. If you want to stop sharing your presentation, then we'll just keep our cameras on respectively if anyone has any questions. I suppose the first one I had, just to kick things off, was how you address the kind of culture of data sharing in an organisation where there were actually internal barriers, which were, I suppose, in part regulatory, and perhaps a reluctance to share data, which, given the sensitivity of it, we're talking kind of, a distribution network, just sharing that externally. Not all of it, but there's a culture of, I suppose, keeping things internally, and then that has to shift. So how do you address that? Not necessarily overnight, but...
Definitely not overnight is the answer. It is a culture shift, and that takes time because there are many people involved in decision making there. So for people who manufacture and create the data, helping them understand how it's used across its lifetime, to the business and I guess data owners who might have historically a different perception or risk appetite around this, to how you're actually going to make it available and who you're going to make it available to and in what form. So there's a lot of questions to be answered. As part of the requirements as we move into what's called the EV2 period, so essentially where our networks business will be operating from 2023 to 2028, it's one of the questions that we need to answer. And so we are actively engaged with the Energy Networks Association and groups like Icebreaker One to understand what data would people find useful, to try and quality assure it, to check its suitability for the use cases, and to make sure we've got the right governance mechanisms in place to support it. So it is a bit of a journey, but I have been there before with banking. So I would say if you'd have told me that we were going to share data through APIs for banking, have lots of exchanges of data in that way to support customers through understanding their share of wallet, etc., and services. When I first went in, it was a phenomenal amount. But we did get there, and I think there's lots of lessons the energy industry can learn from that. But it is a slightly different model, and I think the key thing for us is probably understanding which data is valuable and how to make it available. And so long as it's not at odds with, I guess, some of the protections in place for critical national infrastructure, the assumption should be that it's presumed open. It's not our data, it's data about the nation's network. And so if we can and should share that data responsibly, it's up to us to find how do we do that, which we are actively working through at the moment.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Any other questions from attendees? Nothing showing up in the chat. I'll ask one final one, Lee, before we move on. What about the smart meter data? Because obviously that I suppose is for the average consumer the thing they'd be thinking about the most in relation to utilities and kind of something like open data. I mean, how has that changed the perception of the value or otherwise of data internally at ScottishPower? Or because that has been, I suppose, for the consumer, that's been their first exposure to this potential new way of an interchange of information. You know, that data being their data through the smart meter, but has that shifted anything internally, or has maybe the slow rollout not made any particular tangible changes?
No, I think it has. I mean, it's a huge learning point for us. I think we're still learning about the value of that data, and we are obviously careful and kind of following the letter of the law around how that data can be used. But I think there are already some use cases where we've seen it be particularly useful. So we have actually, for example, put in a trigger-based alert system. So these meters are beaming back data on whatever frequency has been agreed with the customer installation. And we have picked up a couple of situations where there's been an issue in the property. And actually, we've been able to intervene from a safety point of view. And I think that's a really good illustration of where that data coming in a stream and allowing us to be more kind of, it's not real time, but a higher frequency of responsiveness has, no doubt allowed us to intervene at an earlier stage and hopefully prevent some of the worst impacts of issues at the property. But I think the key value from the smart data is giving information back to the consumer. And then also helping us understand how is that model of energy demand and consumption changing over time, so that we can build the most recent information into our simulations and make sure that we're set up to support it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Lee. I think unless there's any other questions, we'll move on to our next speaker, which I think we'll do Peter, but Sarah is going to run the presentation because I think we did a few issues with Peter's presentation. So Sarah, if you're able to share your screen and run, Peter will give you the nod in relation to slides. So I'll let you take over from here, Peter. Thank you.
Thanks, Darren. I really appreciate the opportunity of being able to speak today and to your audience. I mean, this is such a critical question and issue, as we all know, in terms of where we are now, not only here in Scotland, Europe, and the rest of the world, but in terms of the big net zero question. The question is on me, I'm trying to answer this afternoon, is what is data's role in all of that, and how can we drive every initiative forward to that goal. So Sarah, if I could have the next slide, please. What I've started with here, I'll come on and describe who we are, my company GSI, in the next slide. What I thought I'd do is just go big picture to start with and talk about the innovation. This is the title of the webinar today. It's about innovation for data. So I put that in terms of satellite services. We deal in huge volumes of data. If you think of all the satellite constellations buzzing around the Earth at the moment, you're talking of downloads of petabytes per day, which is huge volume, and it's all got to be downloaded, stored, analyzed, and then spat out into all the various user groups to access and so on. So, the question was earlier on, Darren, where is it? It's all cloud-based. It's all web services now. It's the way we deal with that. It is, in the majority of cases, in terms of what we're talking about here, open source data. So this is to my first point. Where we've come from in satellite services is from a scientific point of view to start with. And science is pretty much, as you know, is government funded, institutionally funded as a discipline within the world. But if you look at what's happening in terms of net zero, it's about climate change. And that, I would argue quite strongly in terms of how we've been able to get past those barriers of skepticism and disbelief in terms of presenting facts to our various stakeholders and audiences. Satellites have been able to do that, whether that's deforestation, melting ice caps, changes in sea surface temperature, etc. Satellites and the constellations go back a long way, so we can produce the analysis over a combined coherent period of time to give a very accurate picture of what's happening. And in terms of what's happening, it's about change. Yeah. So what we do is based on that scientific information. What we've got to try and do here, I think, to answer this net zero question, is work in a non-expert way, being able to translate that into something meaningful for our various stakeholders. We ourselves have had to go through a big education loop with our users in terms of, for example, we work in forestry. Forestry has been around for a long time, and those guys are saying to us, what could you possibly tell us from an asset that's sitting up 60 or 130 kilometer up in the sky that we don't know already? So you got to get through these barriers with a point of acceptance with the key stakeholders. Not only that, there's a tendency, I think, with a lot of tech and tech companies is to get wrapped up in technology for technology's sake and solutions for that. What we've got to do, and I mean all of us, have really got to understand and adapt our tech and our tech solutions to whatever the policy or the policy agendas are. Lee mentioned COP26 coming up next month. We've really got to gear ourselves to support these various policy, understand policy in the first place, and then be able to translate what it is we understand to support those. So we've, as I said, huge volumes of data, but these data sets are complex. It's not all about looking at Google and nice, photos and so on in terms of being able to do interpretation. It's much more complex than that in terms of the pre-processing and the processing of the imagery to take it through to something that is can be ingested and taken in a form that means something to our users. So that's what we call analysis ready data. So we're taking out the edge, the complete edge of the raw data, the science behind that, the processing, which needs a lot of expertise to be able to do that. I think that's the challenge for not just satellite services, but all of us, is to support an agenda like that. So Sarah, if I could have the next slide, please. So GSI is an SME, so we're the other end of the telescope to ScottishPower. We've been around in Edinburgh since 2013. We have about 15 folk there and remote offices in the US and Canada as well, which actually happens to be where our main market is at the moment. What we do is we specialize in forestry, environmental science, remote sensing, and machine learning. So the question often asked of us, are you a space company? Well, we are in part a space company because we rely on the space assets and space data, but we're actually a technology company as well. we're a data company because of that huge volume of data. So we employ data science. We're an environmental science company because we've got to understand the environmental consequences of what we're talking about here. So, and what we do is, and I'll explain in the next slide in terms of how we do it, and this is critical to understanding data innovation, is we look at forestry, land use, and carbon opportunities in terms of the carbon sequestration in forests, and therefore being able to create the carbon offset opportunities. That is such a big demand in the marketplace at the moment. It's driving everything. When you imagine the big corporates are thirsting and driving after finding where the forest carbon opportunities are. Forest carbon isn't the only opportunity for carbon offsetting. You've got to think of soil carbon, peatland, particularly in Scotland, the various opportunities, marine sinks and so on. So a number of carbon sequestration opportunities. We happen to focus on forestry as the main one for us. So we use a combination of, as it says, artificial intelligence, different sensors, different sensor platforms to blend into our analytics at the end of the day. So it's not just all about satellites. I should emphasize that point, and it'd be wrong. And some people get stuck on that. It's wrong. It's the combination of the data sources and what you do with the information to create it into some kind of knowledge and value. And then, we are driven at the very high level by the macro level in terms of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, net zero targets, and the very rapidly emerging environmental social governance metrics, which the market, especially the financial markets, are driving very hard at the moment. So the question would be, can those be in any way monitored from space? Well, the answer is yes, depending on what it is you want to monitor, over what period of time, and to what level of and degree of accuracy you want to be able to report that. It would be the question, but yes, it's possible. There are a number of satellite constellations operating now that can, for example, monitor greenhouse gas emissions doesn't matter where in the world they can be monitored, and to a very high level of accuracy. You've got radar satellites which can monitor change over time. That's what they're very good at, so that they know can be, depending on the constellation, from several hours, 12 hours, 24 hours to days. They can monitor change over time so that we know if an area, for example, where we work, if there's a logging operation going on or any kind of, and then you can then measure that against whether, for example, that area that is being logged has the necessary permits and permissions from whoever the local authority or the certification issuing body has given the green light for that to be deforested. So you can then say, well, we can actually detect illegal deforestation around the world as well. So I'm just trying to, by giving illustration of example of what it is we can do. Sarah, if I could have the next slide. So what we're illustrating here is, I'll start at the top. So satellites are not the only sensor. It's the combination of, you'll be familiar with aircraft flying over areas and been around for 50, 60 years of taking photography of various target areas. What they do, they can do fairly accurate pictures of forestry using that and using specific cameras called LiDAR. And then those are now on board UAVs as well to record that data. LiDAR is very good at being able to see forests very accurately. There is a new NASA mission coming on board that will actually be able to present forests in 3D around the world. You'll be able to look at forests in 3D. And then there is where you're at, the traditional forestry is the ground survey. This is foresters. Literally, what they do is they walk around the forest ranches, the forest plots, and they'll be looking around at the various tree species, making tree height estimates, maturity estimates, circumference estimates, and so on, in order to extrapolate a picture exactly what's in that forest. Now, the up and down arrow here is, and the dollar signs associated with it, try and give just a very simplistic idea in terms of what that costs to do it. As you might imagine, the actual in situ or ground survey reference data, sorry, can you stick with that one, Sarah? Thank you. Is more expensive, and it gets less expensive the further up the tree you go. But what we're saying is from satellite, principally because it's continuous. Satellites are continually orbiting Earth. It's on all the time. It's open source. So in terms of access to the data and the images, it's free of charge. The cost comes in the interpretation, the pre-processing, the processing, and then converting that into some form of analytics. That's where the hard work is, and its combination with the other sensors. Okay, Sarah, let's move on. So what we're doing with our data is, as I say, we're taking that combination of the satellite, the other remote, RS is remote sensing, another word for Earth observation, like LiDAR, and we're taking that into our data refinery. Just on the left, just to give you an example of some of the advances here in terms of what's happening, there's one company who've developed an app on an iPhone 12, which has the LiDAR camera on it. And you can go into the forest and you can take your picture of a tree or a bunch of trees and then upload that to a platform. And that then takes the form of a ground reference data, which we can then employ and integrate and merge with our other data. We put this into our data refinery, as we call it. So what you're doing is you're taking in that raw data, you're cleaning out the various, what we call noise. There's a lot of noise in satellite data, satellite imagery. We're doing then adding on the geospatial processing of that in terms of location and specifics about exactly where that is. Might be because every forest is not on flat land, in terms of determining various heights of land and contours around it to give a full picture of what that looks like. We are then deploying our own machine learning algorithms, combination of that data with that ground survey. We have to have the ground truthing, that ground truth data, what we call the reference data set, in order to prove out what we're saying. And the clients demand that as well, because that's what they're familiar with, and they want to know that whatever we're supplying to them matches and concurs somehow with their own work and their own reference data for that. And then from that, we then build up this database in terms of prediction. So what we're doing here, we're providing data, in our case in forests, for tree height, tree species, circumference, and a few other attributes. Those are absolutely key in terms of people who manage and own those forestry assets. It might be valuation, it might be a buy-sell opportunity, it might be looking to what's got to be logged in there, what species are available for logging, what maturity they are. That can be then fed into the logging company, the sawmill company, the ultimate user. We work a lot in the US, so for white oak in the southern states, that might be for the whiskey industry, the whiskey barrels themselves, for the Jack Daniels of this. This can all be done very accurately from space, but it has to be in the form of accurate analytics. So where we're at is around accuracy. Satellites, the other big attribute or big advantage of satellites over fixed wing aircraft and drones, we can do it at scale. As you can imagine, we can do all of this at scale. Talking about many tens of thousands, indeed millions of acres and hectares is our typical surveying. You just cannot, that drones, for example, just cannot operate at that scale over that time with that level of accuracy. So next slide, please. So from what it is we do, this is an illustration of what we call an assembly line in terms of being able to put all those data elements, if I call it that, in order to move from left to right in terms of ARD or analysis ready data over on the right hand side. And basically, and that's what we're in business for, is for us not only to monetize that, but also for our customers to be able to monetize that and be part of their commercial transaction. So it starts on the left from the data ingest, as I've said, multi-source, multi-sensor, multi-format, whatever it is, into our platform. And then we do the abstraction. QC is hugely important here, hugely important in terms of being able to do the QC, QA, and produce an audit trail of that, quite obviously. So what we're getting from this stage of the assembly line is clean, harmonized data. We then apply in the middle section the machine learning against that data we're bringing in, against the reference data which I've been talking about. So we can do that and gain our confidence by doing the sampling in order to come up with the accurate prediction. And over to the right hand side, then we're developing and delivering the almost cookie cutter oven ready data that customers can make decisions on and from. So when you are buying and selling forest ranches in the US, which are all wild, unlike most of the UK and in particular Scotland, then you're talking ranch values anywhere from 10 to 50 to 70 to $100 million is not untypical in a transaction. What they need to know is that the validity and the verification of that data to support that transaction in terms of the valuation from the buy and the sell side. Hugely important. So we're doing this for forestry. This is the example I'm giving you, but a lot of other companies employ a similar approach and methodology. But this satellites is absolutely key in terms of the question of us today is about data-driven innovation for net zero. This is just but one application. So if you think the same capability can be applied to agriculture, agricultural insurance, it can be applied to rainforest degradation, illegal deforestation. It can be applied to a marine environment for monitoring oil slicks, sea surface temperature, as I say, just change generally. It can be applied, as Lee was saying earlier on, to the monitoring of critical infrastructure in terms of anything that, from an analytics point of view, has to be looked at historically. If you're going to build something or change something, looking forward as to what that historical data is, what effect it may or may not have in terms of any change to that infrastructure. So, for example, we've seen a lot of this, a couple of recent examples in South America where you're looking at dams that have unfortunately burst or the dam structure has broken and had horrific consequences on the back of that. If there were a monitoring system in place, at least what it could do, we're not saying it can prevent. What we're saying here is by continually analyzing data, you can at least get some form of early warning here in terms of any potential danger. So you think of, in particular here in the UK, then flooding has been over a few seasons now, a particular challenge to that. So now in the UK, we've got to some very accurate predictive monitoring about if a weather front is predicted in a certain area, and it's predicted that a model predicted that a certain amount of rainfall is going to fall in that area. You can then start to construct some very accurate models along with our meteorological friends, along with our environment friends, local authority, to understand impact if that is the case, what happens. So against that model, you then monitor the actual rainfall and the change over the river actual extent, to see if it's going to flood, predict it, if it's going to flood, and critically, the really critical thing is, where is it going to flood? This can all be done not just from space, but with other sensors as well. But obviously, space and satellite data is a huge component of this kind of capability and this opportunity. Okay, Sarah, if we can go to our next slide, please. Now, as we're talking here in Scotland, then that we have, I mean, space in Scotland generally is a very strong and thriving, growing industrial sector, economic sector of the Scottish economy, whether that is launching spacecraft, the actual design and build of the satellites themselves, or the space launch vehicles. But where we are is what we call downstream. So these are companies or organizations who, once the satellite is up there and is beginning to download its data back down to planet Earth, these are the specialist companies that then are, as I say, as I've described to you, taking that data and doing the interpretations and providing the analysis for their clients. Now, we're lucky in Scotland here that we have a number of these companies, all supported, I should say, by a really strong academic backbone in terms of Earth observation, in terms of remote sensing, physics, data science. You know, if you put all those, the combination of those disciplines together, you have all the disciplines you need and require in order to be very good at, an expert at this area of data science. So ECCI, the Edinburgh Climate Change Institute, is linked to University of Edinburgh down at High School Yards in Edinburgh. There are various, it tends to be Edinburgh in terms of where these companies are. I think that's more an accident of geography more than anything else. But, you know, companies like ourselves, who I've described to you, Ecometrica, Space Intelligence, a spin out from Edinburgh University, AstraSat, based in Musselburgh, Carbomap, a spin out of Edinburgh Uni again, DCAT is actually in Glasgow, and LTS out at the Roslin Research Plant there, or at Research Institute, sorry. So in terms of, if we localize it and look just at Scotland in terms of what have we got here, how can we support Scotland and its own net zero goals and objectives, going back to policy to be able to understand that. I think we're in a very, very good position. I think we've got good and close links with Scottish Government and other institutions and agencies like Data Lab today, like Census in Glasgow and so on. So in terms of the innovation centres in Scotland, about how we can prove out and how we can utilise space data and integrate that into solutions for finding ways to mitigate the effects of climate change and reaching those net zero goals. That's the challenge, I think. It's not just satellite data, it's in front of all of us, actually. And we're quite well advanced, especially in terms of our conversation and dialogue with Scottish Government. Key for us is actually engaging Scottish Government as a customer and working with us to utilise that. They take leadership from that. If they're taking leadership in that area, then others would surely and hopefully follow. But that's my thesis kind of for today, Darren, really, in terms of what we're about here.
Thank you, Peter. I suppose any questions from those attendees before I ask my question? I'll give people a second. Nothing there in a moment. Well, I'll just ask mine anyway, Peter. Obviously, you talked about kind of analysis-ready data. I mean, how close are we to services being ready for customers to take on without employing PhDs or possessing specialist skills? So it really is a service. I mean, what kind of level of maturity is the market at? Do customers even know quite what they want?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's a good question, Darren. So I think there's still an element of education here, an element of understanding in terms of what it can do and how you could incorporate it into your normal business model. Absolutely, yeah. But yes, so we're getting it to the point where, so a forestry company does not need experts to be able to take our data, yeah, any longer. They might have done in the past, but not any longer. The companies that did have that kind of capability typically were the oil and gas companies, who had their own geospatial teams and so on to be able to take that data and interpret it. But it's a move away from that, even in oil and gas, and they're now being able to just accept the data feed and the analytics from companies like ourselves and others in terms straight away.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And I suppose, I mean, finally, just another question for me in terms of the connectivity to the academic community. I mean, you obviously mentioned that because of the nature and the challenges of working with kind of Earth observation data, that must be a key going for, has been, I think, understandably for GSI in the past, and then going forward to have those close links.
Absolutely, it's critical. So you wouldn't be being an Edinburgh-based company. We work really closely with Edinburgh University, and that means it could mean various touch points. It could be access to interns to come and join us for 3-6 months or full-time jobs, but it has been on the research side, so talking at the sort of departmental level, the geomatics department, so the Professor Ian Woodhouses and Matt Williams and so on at Edinburgh Uni, and talking to them to understand, you know, the high level, the big picture, and being able to work with them to interpret that and support us. I mean, somebody like you, Professor Woodhouse, is one of the world's leading experts in this area.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for your time today.